Henry Morton Stanley. Henry Morton Stanley was, like most English explorers of his time, a rather enterprising soul. After emigrating from Wales to the United States in the spring of 1859, just before the American Civil War broke out, Stanley was taken under the wing of a stranger. He later wrote the stranger acted like a father to him, and was why Stanley had replaced his own birth name, John Rowlands, with his. Stanley was helped to find some manual work in New Orleans, but was soon sternly pressured to join the Civil War against the Southern secession. Having fought for the Confederate Army, deserted the Union Army, and worked as a ship's writer for the Federal Navy, he then found his way into journalism. He took his reportage into the wild American West before going overseas to the Ottoman Empire, a trip that resulted in his brief imprisonment after clashing with local Turks. But Stanley's true claim to fame came when he decided to gamble his life to impress one of the most well-known newspapers in America, the New York Herald. Leaving his old job as an editor for the Missouri Democrat, he then traveled to New York, walked into the offices of the Herald, and pitched to the fierce-eyed and imperious-looking young man named James Gordon Bennett Jr. At first being dismissed, Stanley managed to convince Bennett to fund his coverage in Africa of what would become the Battle of Magdala, the British expedition against Theodore, Emperor of Ethiopia. Stanley later traveled across parts of the Middle East, India, and Europe for the Herald, but his most extraordinary request to Bennett was agreed on October 16, 1869. Stanley persuaded Bennett that he will be the one to find the famed British missionary explorer, David Livingston, who vanished in what is now Tanzania without a trace. Livingston had been missing for 2 years in Central Africa, over 700 miles from the eastern coast, and was one of the few parts of the world that had yet to be mapped. Despite this, at 30 years old, Stanley made his first foray towards Lake Tanganyika in March of 1871, fitted out with over 100 men. 3 caravans filled with precious food and provisions had been planned along the way to Lake Tanganyika for Livingston, where he had been last seen. Only one had in fact reached the explorer. Over the course of the search, Stanley faced starvation, cannibal tribes, allies dying of dysentery, smallpox, and malaria. In September, while struck with a fever himself, he still managed to write that, "No living man or living men shall stop me. Only death can prevent me. But I shall not die. I will not die. I cannot die." Livingston's situation was similarly miserable. He was barely able to walk, plagued with internal bleeding, and flesh-eating ulcers were feasting on his feet. The one caravan that had arrived to Livingston had been secretly gutted and sold by the man tasked with delivering it. In late October, after a 7th-month trek, the group, now only 33 men, finally made it to Ujiji on Lake Tanganyika, hearing rumors of a white man with gray whiskers that had arrived recently nearby. And it was there that Stanley found Livingston, sick, largely abandoned, and without supplies. The famous line, "Dr. Livingston, I presume?" may have been uttered here, though it's unlikely since there's no record of it at the time. It's likely that Stanley added that to the story for dramatic effect. Whatever the case, having noted Livingston's location, Stanley returned to safety and sent supplies to Livingston, who continued his search for the Nile. He resumed his search in a quest that would lead to his death in 1873. Stanley, meanwhile, used that year to pile on his own self-acclaim, writing the book How I Found Livingston. The Royal Geographic Society was less than pleased that an American had to bail out their star explorer, but when Livingston died, Stanley appointed himself the heir of African exploration. Stanley's return to Africa came in 1874, backed by the money from the New York Herald and the Daily Telegraph. This time, he had a clear objective, and it was a bold one: to complete the mapping of the African Great Lakes and rivers, circumnavigating Lakes Victoria and Tanganyika, and locating the source of the Nile. Through his efforts, Stanley was successful from the beginning, locating the only outlet of Lake Victoria, Ripon Falls. Seeing that this was not the source of the Nile, Stanley returned to a river that Livingston had dubbed the Lualaba. While Livingston had traced the river north in 1871, he hadn't finished, and Stanley picked up where his predecessor left off. For almost a year, Stanley followed the river until it was identifiable as the Congo River, not the Nile. But it accomplished another of Stanley's ambitious objectives. He followed the river all the way to the sea, utilizing both dugout canoes and sectional boats to account for the rapids and cataracts. Many drowned in the navigation of the rapids, adding to the death toll that was already hacking away at the expeditionary team. When they finally reached the Portuguese outpost of Boma, only 114 of the 228 who set out remained, and Stanley being the only European of the bunch. In his own telling of the journey, Stanley credits his 20 African porters with the success of the journey, without whom, he writes, they could not have proceeded but a few days. It was Stanley's third African expedition that would properly eviscerate what good reputation he had built up to this point. Having been approached by the Belgian King Leopold II, only later known for his infamous cruelties in Africa, Stanley initially declined, hoping for an American or British-backed expedition. But Leopold would not take no for an answer, and thus Stanley eventually gave in, agreeing to be Leopold's leader in the African continent. Now, in his 40s, Stanley's expedition was off to an inauspicious beginning. Leopold told an outright lie to Stanley about his own ambitions, saying that it was meant to open Congo to international trade and abolish the slave trade, when in fact he wanted the Congo all for himself. Having no way of knowing that, Stanley proceeded to spend 1879 to 1884 in the Congo Basin, constructing roads and outposts. While that may sound easy, it was anything but. Faced with dysentery and malaria, hunger and wounds, Stanley led the way as best he could through torrential downpours and thick jungle walls. But through it all, he persevered and earned his nickname, Breaker of Rocks. When Stanley found out about King Leopold's true objective of turning the Congo into a colony for Belgium, he was shocked. Stanley called it madness and told Leopold that the Congolese tribes will retain their own autonomy. In response, Leopold threw a tantrum and destroyed as many treaties as he could find that had been negotiated by Stanley thus far into the expedition. Nevertheless, still technically working for Leopold, Stanley returned to Africa one last time in January of 1887 to what is now South Sudan. Stanley was assigned to rescue a provincial Egyptian governor by the name of Mehmed Amin Pasha. Amin had his supply lines cut off by locals called Mahdists who had revolted against their Egyptian rulers. After a few months into the search, Stanley was faced with a decision that would later prove disastrous to his reputation. At Leopoldville, Stanley had too few steamers to continue carrying his entire expedition to Amin. He had to choose from either endangering Amin's life by waiting 2 months for more vessels, or split the expedition into two so that at least half of the party may continue with the rescue. While his choice of the latter succeeded in helping him find Amin quicker, the tragic fate of those he had left behind would sour his champagne. Those at the rear guard of his expedition were commanded to wait for supplies and reinforcements at a remote village before they could rejoin with Stanley. After waiting for 13 months, frustrated and desperate, the rear guard began abusing the local Africans, stealing food, beating and abducting them ruthlessly. Consequently, Stanley's legacy was further tarnished, where once he had been seen as an upstanding, even fair explorer, he was increasingly portrayed as a regular colonial abuser. While he didn't know of the atrocities of the rear column until much later, it would take even longer for his reputation to repair, and even still, he remains a debated figure. Following this expedition, Stanley retired, married, and adopted a son. He was made a Knight of the Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath in 1899, becoming Sir Henry Morton Stanley. He lived out the rest of his knightly days at a small estate in Surrey with his family.